Maria Santos pressed her face against the cold window of the shelter, watching the rain pour down like angry tears from the dark sky. The storm had been raging for 3 days now, and the small mountain village of San Rafael was completely cut off from the outside world. The bridges were washed out, the roads had turned into rivers, and the phone lines were dead. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked back at the crowded community center. 43 people were crammed into the small building that usually hosted wedding parties and town meetings. Old men sat quietly in corners, their weathered hands folded in their laps. Mothers held crying babies close to their chests, trying to calm them with soft lullabies. Children huddled together on makeshift beds made from donated blankets and coats. The food was almost gone. Maria counted the remaining supplies that morning: 6 cans of beans, 3 loaves of stale bread, and a half-empty bag of rice. It wasn't enough to feed everyone for even one more day. The village store had been swept away by the flood on the second night, taking all their emergency supplies with it. Dr. Rodriguez, the village's only doctor, knelt beside elderly Carmen Flores in the corner. The old woman had been diabetic for 20 years and her insulin had run out yesterday morning. Her breathing was shallow and her skin felt cold and clammy. Without her medication, everyone knew she didn't have much time left. "How is she?" Maria whispered, approaching the doctor. Dr. Rodriguez shook his head slowly. "Not good. I've done everything I can with what we have here, but she needs real medical attention. She needs her insulin." He looked around the room at the other villagers, and she's not the only one. Little Pedro has been running a high fever for 2 days. His mother thinks it might be pneumonia. Maria felt her heart sink even deeper. Pedro was only 7 years old, with bright brown eyes and a smile that could light up the whole village. His mother, Isabella, had been pacing the floor all night, pressing wet cloths to his burning forehead and whispering prayers. The mayor, Carlos Mendoza, stood near the front door talking quietly with the other village leaders. Maria could see the worry lines etched deep into his face. He had been trying to stay strong for everyone, but the weight of responsibility was crushing him. As the storm hit, he had organized the evacuation from the lower parts of the village. He had helped carry the elderly to safety and made sure every family found shelter. But now, with no way to call for help and no way out, even he was starting to lose hope. Outside, the wind howled like a wild animal, rattling the windows and doors of the shelter. Every few minutes, they could hear the crash of falling trees or the rumble of rocks sliding down the mountain. The river that used to flow gently through their village had turned into a monster, swallowing everything in its path. Maria remembered how peaceful San Rafael used to be. The village sat in a beautiful valley surrounded by green mountains, where families had lived for generations. People grew corn and beans in small gardens behind their houses. Children played soccer in the dusty streets after school. On Sundays, everyone gathered in the little white church to sing hymns and share stories. But now their church was underwater. Half the houses in the village had been destroyed or badly damaged. The school where Maria taught first grade was gone completely, swept away like it had never existed. Years of memories, family photos, and precious belongings were lost forever. Young Miguel Herrera sat near the back wall, holding his pregnant wife Sophia's hand. She was 8 months along, and the stress of the disaster had brought on early labor pains. Dr. Rodriguez had managed to stop the contractions for now, but he worried that the baby might come before help arrived. The thought of delivering a baby in these conditions, without proper equipment or clean supplies, terrified him. "The radio still isn't working," announced Juan, the village mechanic who had been trying to fix their old emergency radio for hours. He held up the broken device with frustration. "The battery is dead and the antenna is damaged. I don't think we can repair it." That radio had been their last hope of contacting the outside world. Without it, no one would know they were trapped. No one would know they needed help. The nearest town was 50 miles away on the other side of the mountains, and even in good weather it took hours to reach by car. As night began to fall, Maria lit the last few candles they had left. The generator had stopped working that morning when the fuel ran out. Soon they would be sitting in complete darkness, listening to the storm rage outside while trying not to think about their empty stomachs and growing fears. Father Antonio, the village priest, tried to keep everyone's spirits up by leading them in prayer. His voice was strong and steady as he asked God to watch over them and send help soon. Some people joined in, finding comfort in the familiar words, Others just stared at the floor, lost in their own thoughts and worries. But Maria noticed that even Father Antonio's hands shook as he held his prayer book. Even their spiritual leader, who always knew the right thing to say, seemed to be running out of hope. The reality was becoming impossible to ignore. They were completely alone, cut off from the world, with no way to save themselves. The children had stopped asking when they could go home. They seemed to understand, in the way that children do, that something was very wrong. Instead of playing games or telling jokes like they usually did, they stayed close to their parents and spoke in whispers. As Maria looked around the shelter one more time before trying to sleep, she wondered if tomorrow would bring any relief. The weather forecast they had heard on the radio before it broke said the storm would last at least another week. Could they survive that long? Could Carmen make it through the night? Could little Pedro fight off his fever without proper medicine? She pulled her blanket over her head and tried to block out the sounds of crying babies and worried whispers. Somewhere in the darkness she could hear Isabella singing softly to Pedro, the same lullaby she had sung to her own children years ago. The storm outside seemed to be getting stronger, as if nature itself was determined to test how much the people of San Rafael could endure. But inside the crowded shelter, 43 hearts kept beating, and 43 souls refused to give up completely. Not yet. Dawn broke gray and gloomy over San Rafael, but Maria Santos barely noticed the weak sunlight filtering through the shelter windows. She had spent most of the night awake, listening to Carmen Flores's labored breathing and watching little Pedro toss and turn with fever. When she finally dozed off near morning, her dreams were filled with images of rising water and falling trees. The fourth day of their isolation began with heartbreak. Dr. Rodriguez knelt beside Carmen's still form, gently closing her eyes while her daughter Elena sobbed quietly beside him. The old woman had passed away in her sleep, her body finally giving up its fight against the diabetes that had slowly been poisoning her blood. She went peacefully, the doctor whispered to Elena. Though his own voice cracked with emotion, Carmen had been like a grandmother to the whole village. She had delivered most of the babies born in San Rafael over the past 30 years, including Pedro and many of the other children now trapped in the shelter. Mayor Mendoza gathered the men together to discuss what to do with Carmen's body. In normal times, they would have held a proper funeral in the church with flowers and music and a feast afterward. But the church was still underwater, and they had no flowers, no music, and certainly no food for a feast. They wrapped her gently in a clean white sheet and carried her to the small storage room behind the shelter, where she would rest until they could give her the burial she deserved. The loss of Carmen hit everyone hard, but it seemed to affect the children most of all. They had seen death before. This was a farming village where animals were born and died as part of life. But losing someone they all loved made their situation feel much more frightening and real. Pedro's fever had gotten worse during the night. His small body shivered under his blanket while his mother Isabella pressed cool cloths to his forehead. His lips were dry and cracked, and he barely had the strength to sip the little bit of water they could spare for him. Dr. Rodriguez feared that without antibiotics, the boy's pneumonia would soon become deadly. The food situation was becoming desperate. Maria divided the last few cans of beans among the families with the smallest children, but it wasn't nearly enough. Grown men who worked hard in the fields every day were trying to survive on a few spoonfuls of rice. Nursing mothers worried that they wouldn't be able to produce enough milk for their babies. "We need to try to find food," announced Miguel, Pedro's teenage brother. There might be some supplies left in the houses that weren't completely destroyed. Several of the younger men volunteered to venture out into the flooded village to search for anything useful. It was dangerous work. The water was still high and fast-moving, and debris from destroyed buildings floated everywhere like weapons. But staying in the shelter meant watching their families slowly starve. They formed teams of 3, with each group taking a different section of the village. Miguel led one team toward the area where the small grocery store used to stand. Roberto, the blacksmith, took another group to search the houses near the church. Carlos, the mayor's son, headed toward the school with 2 other young men. Maria watched from the shelter window as the search parties waded through the brown, murky water. The men moved carefully, testing each step before putting their full weight down. They used long sticks to probe ahead of them, watching for hidden holes or dangerous debris. The first team returned after 2 hours with disappointing news. Miguel held up a single can of tomatoes and a bag of flour that had somehow stayed dry. "This is all we could find," he said, shaking water from his hair. Most of the food was swept away or ruined by the flood. Roberto's team had slightly better luck. They managed to rescue a few bottles of cooking oil and some dried corn that had been stored in a high cabinet. But it still wasn't enough to feed 42 people for more than a day or two. The third team took the longest to return, and when they finally came back, Carlos was carrying something unexpected. A small battery-powered radio that had belonged to the schoolteacher. It was damaged, but Juan the mechanic thought he might be able to fix it using parts from the broken radio they already had. While Juan worked on the radio, using a small screwdriver and all his years of experience fixing broken machinery, the village leaders held a difficult conversation. They had to face the truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. They were running out of time. If help doesn't come soon, we're going to lose more people, Dr. Rodriguez said quietly. Pedro needs medicine within the next day or two. Sophia's labor pains are getting stronger, and I don't know how much longer I can delay the birth. And all of us are getting weaker from lack of food. Mayor Mendoza nodded grimly. He had been the leader of San Rafael for 15 years, through good times and bad, but he had never faced anything like this. The storm is supposed to clear tomorrow or the next day, he said. Maybe once the weather improves, someone will notice that they haven't heard from our village. But privately, he knew that might not happen for weeks. San Rafael was small and isolated, tucked away in the mountains where few outsiders ever visited. The nearest government office was in the regional capital, hours away even in good weather. Would anyone notice they were missing? Would anyone think to look for them? Father Antonio continued to lead prayers throughout the day, but Maria noticed that fewer people joined in each time. Hope was becoming a luxury they could barely afford. Energy was better spent conserving strength and taking care of the sick. As evening approached, Juan finally managed to get some sound out of the repaired radio. It was mostly static and interference, but occasionally they could hear faint voices speaking Spanish. The signal was too weak and broken to make out actual words, but just hearing human voices from the outside world felt like a miracle. Keep trying, urged Mayor Mendoza. Even if we can't call for help, maybe we can at least hear a weather report. Juan adjusted the antenna and moved the radio to different positions around the room, searching for a stronger signal. Sometimes the voices became a little clearer, though still impossible to understand. It was like hearing people talking from the bottom of a deep well. That night, as rain continued to fall steadily outside, Maria sat beside Isabella and helped care for Pedro. The boy's breathing was becoming more labored, and his fever showed no signs of breaking. Isabella held his small hand and sang the same lullabies her mother had sung to her when she was sick as a child. "He's going to be okay," Maria whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "Help will come soon." Isabella looked at her with eyes full of tears and fear. "What if it doesn't? What if we're forgotten here? What if no one even knows we need help?" Maria didn't have an answer. She wrapped her arm around Isabella's shoulders and they sat together in the candlelight, listening to Pedro's difficult breathing and the endless sound of rain on the roof. Outside, the storm continued its assault on their small village, washing away not just their homes and possessions, but slowly eroding their hope as well. The radio crackled softly in the corner, still picking up those faint, distant voices that might as well have been coming from another planet. The fifth day dawned with an eerie silence that was almost more frightening than the storm had been. Maria Santos woke to the strange sensation of not hearing rain pounding on the roof. For a moment she thought she might still be dreaming, but when she opened her eyes, pale yellow sunlight was actually streaming through the shelter windows. "The storm stopped," whispered Father Antonio, who had been keeping watch during the early morning hours. His voice carried a mixture of relief and uncertainty, as if he was afraid that speaking too loudly might bring the rain back. People began stirring throughout the shelter, waking to the unfamiliar sound of silence. Children who had grown used to the constant noise of wind and rain looked around in confusion. Even the babies seemed calmer, as if they could sense that something had changed. But the end of the storm brought new worries along with hope. As the villagers ventured outside to survey the damage in daylight, they discovered just how completely their world had been destroyed. Where houses used to stand, only broken foundations remained. The river had carved a new path through the center of town, leaving behind a landscape of mud, rocks, and twisted metal. Dr. Rodriguez emerged from the shelter carrying his medical bag, but his face was grim. Pedro's condition had worsened during the night. The boy's breathing was now so labored that each breath seemed to require tremendous effort. His lips had turned a frightening shade of blue, and his small chest rose and fell rapidly as his body fought for oxygen. "I need to be honest with you," the doctor told Isabella privately. "Without proper medicine and equipment, Pedro doesn't have much time left. Maybe hours, maybe a day at most." Isabella's legs nearly gave out beneath her. She had been preparing herself for this news, but hearing it spoken out loud made it feel suddenly terrifyingly real. Her little boy, who had learned to ride a bicycle just last month, who helped her plant vegetables in their garden, who still asked her to check under his bed for monsters before going to sleep, was dying. Meanwhile, Sophia's labor pains were becoming stronger and more frequent. Miguel held his wife's hand as she gripped the edge of their makeshift bed. Breathing heavily through each contraction, Dr. Rodriguez had hoped the baby would wait until help arrived, but nature had its own schedule. "The baby is coming whether we're ready or not," he told Miguel. "I'll do everything I can, but this isn't exactly ideal conditions for a birth." The doctor had delivered many babies in his career, but always in his clean clinic with proper equipment and medications. Delivering a baby in a crowded, unsanitary shelter with limited supplies would be challenging, even under the best circumstances. And these were far from the best circumstances. Mayor Mendoza organized search parties to look for any supplies that might have survived the flood. With the storm finally over, they could explore areas that had been too dangerous to approach before. Teams of men and women spread out across the village, picking through the wreckage of their former lives. Maria joined a group searching the area where the pharmacy used to stand. If they could find any medicines, especially antibiotics for Pedro or supplies for Sophia's delivery, it might make the difference between life and death. They dug through piles of debris, turning over chunks of concrete and twisted metal, looking for anything useful. After hours of searching, they found a few promising items: some bandages that had stayed dry in a waterproof container, a bottle of antiseptic that was only half empty, and, most importantly, 2 packages of antibiotics that had been sealed in plastic. It wasn't much, but it was something. Dr. Rodriguez examined the antibiotics carefully. They were the right type to treat Pedro's pneumonia, but the packages had been damaged by water and debris. Some of the pills were broken or dissolved, but enough remained intact to possibly help the boy, if it wasn't already too late. "We have to try," Isabella said, her voice hoarse from crying and lack of sleep. "We have to do something." The doctor crushed the remaining pills and mixed them with a small amount of water, creating a bitter medicine that Pedro could hopefully swallow. The boy was barely conscious, but Isabella managed to get him to take the mixture, drop by drop, while everyone in the shelter watched and prayed. Juan had continued working on the radio throughout the morning, and finally achieved a small breakthrough. By extending the antenna with a piece of wire he found in the debris and positioning the radio near a window, he managed to pick up a clearer signal from a station in the regional capital. The voice on the radio was discussing weather conditions across the region, and the villagers gathered around to listen intently. They heard reports about flooding in several areas, damaged roads, and power outages affecting thousands of people. But there was no mention of San Rafael. As far as the outside world knew, their village didn't exist. "We have to try to send a message," urged Carlos, the mayor's son. "There must be some way to let people know we're here." But their radio was only a receiver, not a transmitter. They could hear the outside world, but the outside world couldn't hear them. It was like being able to see through a window but not being able to open it or call out. As afternoon approached, Sophia's contractions became too strong to ignore any longer. Dr. Rodriguez set up the cleanest area he could manage in a corner of the shelter, using sheets that had been boiled in the last of their drinking water. Miguel held his wife's hand while she labored, trying to be strong for her even though fear was written across his face. "Everything is going to be fine," he kept telling her, though his voice shook with uncertainty. "Our baby is going to be healthy and strong." The other villagers tried to give the couple privacy while still being close enough to help if needed. Children were moved to the far side of the shelter and kept busy with quiet games and stories. Father Antonio led soft prayers, asking for God's blessing on the new life that was about to enter their difficult world. Just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the shelter windows, Pedro opened his eyes for the first time in hours. His breathing seemed slightly easier and there was a hint of color returning to his pale cheeks. "Mama?" he whispered, his voice weak but clear. Isabella nearly collapsed with relief. "I'm here, baby. Mama's right here." Dr. Rodriguez examined the boy carefully, hardly daring to hope. The antibiotics seemed to be working, at least a little. Pedro's fever had broken and his breathing was becoming more normal. It was too early to be certain, but for the first time in days, the doctor allowed himself to believe that the child might survive. "He's getting better," he whispered to Maria, who had been helping care for Pedro. "I think he's going to make it." But their moment of hope was interrupted by Sophia's sharp cry of pain. Her labor was progressing rapidly, and there was no more time to prepare. Dr. Rodriguez washed his hands as best he could and knelt beside her, drawing on all his experience and training. "The baby is coming now," he announced to Miguel. "Stay with your wife. Talk to her. Help her stay calm." As night fell over the devastated village of San Rafael, new life was struggling to enter the world while around them, 42 survivors clung to whatever hope they could find. Pedro's recovery gave them all something to celebrate, but Sophia's difficult labor reminded them that they were still very much alone, still cut off from the help they desperately needed. The radio continued its steady stream of voices from the outside world, speaking of weather and news and ordinary problems that seemed impossibly distant from their reality. But those voices were proof that the world beyond the mountains was still there, still functioning, still full of people who might help them if only they knew where to look. Sofia Herrera's baby girl came into the world just after midnight on the 6th day, announcing her arrival with strong, healthy cries that echoed through the shelter. Dr. Rodriguez held the tiny infant up for her parents to see. And for a moment, everyone in the building forgot about their hunger, their fear, and their desperate situation. "She's beautiful," Miguel whispered, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his daughter for the first time. The baby was small but appeared healthy, with a full head of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly. Sofia, exhausted but smiling, reached out to hold her child. "What will you name her?" asked Father Antonio, who had been praying throughout the difficult delivery. Sofia looked around the shelter at all the faces watching them. Neighbors who had become family during these terrible days. People who had shared their last bits of food and offered comfort when everything seemed hopeless. "Esperanza," she said softly. "We'll call her Esperanza." Hope. It seemed like the perfect name for a baby born in such dark times. A reminder that life continued even when everything else fell apart. The birth of little Esperanza lifted everyone's spirits, but it also highlighted how precarious their situation remained. Dr. Rodriguez had managed the delivery with minimal supplies, but both mother and baby needed proper medical care. Sofia had lost a significant amount of blood, and without proper nutrition, she would have trouble producing enough milk to feed the infant. "We need to find food today," Mayor Mendoza announced as dawn broke over the village. "The baby needs her mother to be strong, and we can't help Sofia if we're all starving." Pedro was continuing to improve thanks to the antibiotics they had found, but he was still weak and needed time to recover. His mother, Isabella, had barely left his side, feeding him tiny sips of the precious water they had managed to collect from the rain. The search teams had been through most of the accessible areas of the village, but Carlos suggested they try venturing further out, toward the small farms that dotted the mountainside around San Rafael. These family plots were where villagers grew corn, beans, and vegetables to feed their families throughout the year. Some of the crops might have survived, he reasoned. Even if the plants were damaged, there could be vegetables still in the ground that we can dig up. It was dangerous to go so far from the shelter, especially since the ground was still unstable and more landslides were possible. But with 42 people to feed and a new baby who needed her mother to stay healthy, they had to take the risk. Maria volunteered to join the search party, along with Roberto the blacksmith and several other strong villagers. They set out on foot, carrying makeshift tools and bags to hold whatever they might find. The walk to the nearest farm took them along what used to be a mountain path, but the trail was now blocked with fallen trees and washed-out sections. As they climbed higher up the mountain, the extent of the storm's damage became even more apparent. Entire hillsides had collapsed, sending tons of rock and mud sliding into the valleys below. Trees that had stood for decades were snapped in half or uprooted completely. It looked like a giant had taken a massive stick and stirred up the whole landscape. The first farm they reached had belonged to the Morales family, whose house in the village had been completely destroyed. The farmhouse on the hillside was damaged but still standing, and behind it they found the family's vegetable garden. "Look," Maria called out excitedly. She had been digging in what appeared to be a muddy mess, but her hands had found something solid underneath. Pulling carefully, she extracted a large sweet potato, dirty but undamaged. The search party spread out across the garden, digging with their hands and the simple tools they had brought. Slowly, they began uncovering a treasure trove of buried vegetables, more sweet potatoes, carrots that had been protected by the soil, and even some onions that added precious flavor to their limited meals. At another farm higher up the mountain, they discovered something even better, a small storage shed that had somehow avoided the worst of the flooding. Inside, wrapped in waterproof containers, were bags of dried beans and corn that could feed the entire shelter for several days. "This is like finding gold," Roberto said, carefully loading the precious food into their carrying bags. The Gonzalez family always were smart about storing their harvest. The return trip took longer because they were carrying heavy loads, but nobody complained about the weight. For the first time since the disaster began, they were bringing back enough food to actually fill people's stomachs rather than just keeping them barely alive. When they returned to the shelter that afternoon, the celebration was immediate and heartfelt. Children who had been listless with hunger suddenly found energy to laugh and play. Adults who had been conserving every movement began to smile and joke with each other again. Dr. Rodriguez made sure that Sofia received extra portions to help her produce milk for baby Esperanza. Pedro, though still recovering, managed to eat a small bowl of soup made from the fresh vegetables. Even Father Antonio, who had been giving most of his food to the children, allowed himself a full meal. But their joy was tempered by the continued silence from the outside world. Juan had managed to keep the radio working, and they could hear regular news broadcasts from the regional capital. Reports mentioned ongoing recovery efforts from the storm, with emergency crews working to clear roads and restore power in affected areas. Yet there was still no mention of San Rafael, no indication that anyone knew they were missing or needed help. It was as if their entire village had been erased from the map. "We need to find a way to signal for help," insisted Carlos. "Now that the weather is clearing, maybe aircraft will start flying search and rescue missions. We need to make sure they can see us." The villagers began gathering anything bright or reflective they could find in the wreckage. Pieces of metal roofing, broken mirrors, even colorful clothing that had survived the flood. They arranged these items in a large pattern in the open area in front of the shelter, creating a signal that might be visible from the air. Mayor Mendoza also organized teams to clear debris from what used to be the village's main road. If rescue vehicles could somehow make it through the damaged mountain passes, they needed to be able to reach the shelter. It was exhausting work, moving rocks and fallen trees with only their hands and basic tools, but it gave everyone something productive to do. As the day wore on, they began to hear a new sound in the distance, the rumble of vehicles on the mountain roads far below. The sound was faint and intermittent, but it meant that somewhere, rescue crews were working to reach isolated communities like theirs. "They're coming," whispered Isabella, holding Pedro close as they listened to the distant engines. "Someone is finally coming to help us." But the sounds never got closer. The vehicles seemed to be working on the main highway in the valley, still many miles away from their remote mountain village. The roads leading to San Rafael were probably among the last on any rescue crew's list of priorities. That evening, as they shared their first real meal in days, the villagers talked about what they would do when help finally arrived. Some wanted to rebuild their homes in the same place, determined not to let the storm defeat them. Others thought about relocating to a safer area, perhaps closer to the main town where emergency services could reach them more easily. But all of that planning seemed premature. First, they had to survive long enough to be rescued. They had bought themselves more time with the food they had found, but it wouldn't last forever. And they still faced the challenge of caring for a newborn baby and helping Pedro complete his recovery without proper medical facilities. Baby Esperanza slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware of the discussions happening around her. She had entered a world that was broken and dangerous, but also full of people who were determined to protect her and help her thrive. Her very presence reminded everyone that no matter how bad things got, life found a way to continue. The radio crackled softly in the corner, still carrying voices from the outside world that seemed both impossibly close and impossibly far away. Somewhere beyond the mountains, people were going about their normal lives, complaining about ordinary problems, making plans for the future. Someday soon, the people of San Rafael hoped to rejoin that normal world. But first, they had to make it through another night in their shelter, holding on to each other in the hope that tomorrow might finally bring the help they so desperately needed. The seventh day began with cautious optimism. The sun rose bright and clear over San Rafael, casting golden light on the destruction but also warming the spirits of the survivors. Pedro was strong enough to sit up and eat solid food. Baby Esperanza was nursing well, and the emergency supplies they had found were keeping everyone fed for now. Maria Santos stood outside the shelter, breathing the clean morning air and listening to the sounds of the village slowly coming back to life. Birds had returned to sing in the surviving trees, and she could hear the gentle flow of the river, which had finally returned to something resembling its normal size and speed. But as the morning progressed, new challenges emerged. The radio picked up a weather report that made everyone's heart sink. Another storm system was approaching from the west. It wouldn't be as severe as the one they had just survived, but any amount of rain could cause more flooding and make rescue operations impossible for several more days. "We need to prepare for another storm," announced Mayor Mendoza, though his voice carried the weariness of someone who wasn't sure how much more his people could endure. "We need to secure our supplies and make sure the shelter is as waterproof as possible." The villagers spent the morning reinforcing their temporary home, using pieces of metal roofing and plastic sheeting they had salvaged to patch holes and strengthen weak spots. It wasn't much, but it might keep them dry for a few more days. Dr. Rodriguez was particularly worried about baby Esperanza. Newborn babies were vulnerable to temperature changes and infections, and another period of cold, damp weather could be dangerous for her. He had fashioned a makeshift incubator using blankets and bottles filled with warm water, but it was a poor substitute for proper medical equipment. Just as they finished their preparations, Juan's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. Instead of the usual news broadcast or weather report, they heard a different kind of voice, someone speaking rapidly in military jargon about search and rescue operations. "This is Search Team Alpha requesting coordinates for missing communities in Sector 7, the voice said through the static. "We have reports of several villages that haven't been contacted since the storm." Everyone in the shelter gathered around the radio, straining to hear every word. This was the first indication they had heard that someone was actively looking for missing communities like theirs, but they still had no way to respond, no way to tell the searchers where they were or that they desperately needed help. "If only we could answer them," Carlos said in frustration. "They're looking for us, but they don't know we're here." Father Antonio had an idea. "What if we create a signal they can't miss? Something so big and obvious that anyone flying overhead would have to see it?" They decided to build the largest, most visible signal possible using every available resource. Working together, they cleared a massive area in front of the shelter and began arranging rocks, pieces of metal, and anything else they could find into enormous letters that spelled out help and SOS. The work was exhausting, especially for people who were still recovering from days of inadequate food and stress. But everyone participated, from children who carried small stones to elderly men who directed the placement of larger pieces. Even Sophia, still weak from giving birth, contributed by organizing supplies and caring for other people's children while they worked. By midday, they had created signals that were visible from hundreds of feet away. The letters were outlined in white stones and filled in with bright pieces of metal and colorful cloth. From the air, it should be impossible to miss. As if in response to their efforts, they began hearing aircraft in the distance. The sounds came and went throughout the afternoon, helicopters and small planes crisscrossing the region in search patterns. Each time they heard engines overhead, everyone would run outside and wave anything bright they could find, shouting at the top of their lungs even though they knew the pilots couldn't hear them. But the aircraft never came close enough to see their signals. The search pattern seemed to be focused on other areas, probably communities that were closer to main roads or had better communication systems. San Rafael remained off the beaten path, forgotten in its remote mountain valley. As evening approached, the first clouds of the new storm system began gathering on the western horizon. The wind started picking up and the temperature began to drop. Everyone knew they would soon be back inside the shelter, listening to rain on the roof and wondering if help would ever come. "We can't give up," Isabella said. holding Pedro close as they watched the approaching storm clouds. Someone has to know we're missing. Someone has to be looking for us. But privately, many of the villagers were beginning to lose hope. They had survived the worst storm in living memory, found enough food to keep going for a few more days, and created signals that should have been visible from miles away. Yet they remained as isolated and forgotten as ever. Miguel bounced baby Esperanza gently in his arms, trying to keep her calm as the wind began to rattle the shelter windows. "What kind of world are we bringing her into?" he asked Sophia quietly. "What if this is how things are now? What if no one ever comes?" Sophia touched her husband's face with her tired hand. "Then we make the best life we can for her right here. We rebuild. We survive. We don't give up." Dr. Rodriguez checked on his patients one more time before the storm hit. Pedro was continuing to recover well, his breathing clear and his fever completely gone. Sophia was healing properly from the birth, though she was still weak and needed rest and proper nutrition. Baby Esperanza seemed healthy and strong, nursing well and sleeping peacefully despite all the chaos around her. "We're all going to make it through this," he told Maria as they prepared the shelter for another long night. "I don't know how, but we are." The storm arrived just after sunset, bringing with it a renewal of their fears and challenges. The rain wasn't as heavy as before, but it was steady and cold, seeping through their improvised repairs and creating puddles on the shelter floor. The wind howled around the building, drowning out their voices and making it impossible to hear if any rescue aircraft were still searching. As the night wore on, the villagers huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets and stories to keep their spirits up. The children, who had shown remarkable resilience throughout the ordeal, began asking questions their parents couldn't answer. "When can we go home?" asked little Anna, who was only 5 years old. "When will the electricity come back?" wondered 8-year-old Carlos. "Will we ever see our friends from school again?" whispered Maria Elena, tears in her eyes. The adults tried to provide reassuring answers, but the truth was that none of them knew what the future held. Their homes were gone, their village was destroyed, and they had no idea when or if help would arrive. All they could do was take things one day at a time and hold on to each other. Juan continued monitoring the radio throughout the night, occasionally picking up fragments of military communications about search and rescue operations. The teams were still out there, still looking for missing communities, but they seemed to be working from lists and maps that didn't include San Rafael. "We're not important enough," he said bitterly to Mayor Mendoza. "We're too small, too remote. They probably don't even know we exist." But Mayor Mendoza shook his head. "Every person matters. Every community matters. Someone will remember us. Someone will come looking." As dawn approached on their 8th day of isolation, the storm began to weaken. The rain became lighter, and the wind died down to a gentle breeze. Through the shelter windows, they could see patches of blue sky appearing between the clouds, and then they heard it, a sound that was different from all the aircraft they had heard before. It was deeper, more powerful, with a steady rhythm that seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. It was getting closer instead of fading away. "That's not a helicopter," said Roberto, pressing his ear to the window. "That's something much bigger." The sound grew louder and more distinct, and suddenly Carlos burst through the shelter door, shouting at the top of his lungs, "It's a plane. A big military plane, and it's flying right toward us." Everyone rushed outside, not caring about the light rain that was still falling. There, breaking through the clouds like a vision from heaven, was a massive gray aircraft with 4 propellers and military markings. It was flying low, much lower than any of the other planes they had seen, and it was heading directly for their valley. "They see us," screamed Maria, jumping up and down and waving her arms frantically. "They found us. They finally found us." The plane circled the village once, twice, 3 times, confirming what the crew had spotted from the air. Then it began to climb, gaining altitude as it turned toward the east, back toward civilization and rescue operations headquarters. But this time, the villagers of San Rafael knew they hadn't been forgotten. This time, they knew that help was finally on the way. The C-130 Hercules transport plane had vanished beyond the mountains, but it left behind something the people of San Rafael hadn't felt in over a week: genuine hope. For the first time since the disaster began, they knew with certainty that the outside world was aware of their existence and their desperate situation. "How long do you think it will take for help to arrive?" asked Sophia, holding baby Esperanza close to her chest as they stood in the drizzling rain. still staring at the empty sky where the plane had disappeared. Dr. Rodriguez considered the question carefully. Depends on how badly the roads are damaged and what kind of equipment they need to bring. Could be hours, could be days, but they know we're here now. That's what matters. The sight of the rescue plane had energized everyone in ways that food and rest couldn't. Children who had been quiet and withdrawn suddenly found their voices again, chattering excitedly about the big gray aircraft and what it might mean. Adults who had been conserving every ounce of energy began moving with purpose, preparing for the arrival of their rescuers. Mayor Mendoza organized the villagers into teams to prepare for the rescue operation. One group continued improving the large help and SOS signals they had created, making them even more visible from the air. Another team worked to clear the best possible landing area for helicopters, removing debris and marking the boundaries with bright cloth. We need to be ready for anything, the mayor explained. They might come by helicopter or they might have to hike in on foot if the landing zones aren't safe. Either way, we want to make their job as easy as possible. Maria joined a group that was organizing all their remaining supplies and preparing lists of who needed medical attention first. Pedro was continuing to recover well, but Dr. Rodriguez wanted him evacuated quickly to a real hospital for proper treatment. Baby Esperanza and her mother Sofia would also be high priorities for medical evacuation. The radio had become their lifeline to the outside world, and Juan kept it on constantly now, hoping to pick up any communications about the rescue operation. Around midday, their patience was rewarded when they heard what they had been waiting for. "This is Rescue Command to all units," came a clear, authoritative voice through the speaker. "We have confirmation of survivors at grid reference 77 Alpha. Estimated 40-plus individuals, including children and medical priorities. Prepare for immediate evacuation operations." The shelter erupted in cheers and tears of joy. After 8 days of feeling forgotten and abandoned, they were finally on someone's official list. They were finally important enough to save. But as the hours passed, they realized that being found was only the first step in a complex rescue operation. The mountains around San Rafael were still unstable, with the risk of more landslides. The roads were impassable for ground vehicles. Even helicopter operations would be dangerous in the narrow valley with its unpredictable wind patterns. Late in the afternoon, they heard the distant sound of rotors approaching. Everyone rushed outside again, but this time the helicopter didn't come close enough to land. Instead, it circled the village several times while the crew assessed the situation and looked for the safest place to attempt a landing. Through binoculars that one of the search teams had salvaged, they could see people in the helicopter pointing and taking photographs, documenting the extent of the damage and the condition of the survivors. The aircraft hovered for nearly an hour before finally departing, leaving the villagers feeling both hopeful and frustrated. "Why didn't they land?" demanded Carlos. "We're right here. We need help now." Father Antonio put a calming hand on the young man's shoulder. "They're being careful. They want to make sure they can help us without making the situation worse. Patience, my son. Our rescue will come." As evening fell, the radio brought them more detailed information about the rescue plans. The operation would begin at dawn the following day, using a combination of helicopters and ground teams. The most critical patients, baby Esperanza, Sofia, Pedro, and the elderly villagers, would be evacuated first. The rest would follow in subsequent flights. "They're also bringing supplies," announced Juan, translating the military communications he was hearing. "Medical equipment, food, clean water, and temporary shelters for anyone who wants to stay and help with the cleanup." The news sparked intense discussions among the families about what they wanted to do. Some were eager to leave San Rafael forever, to start over in a safer place where disasters like this couldn't trap them again. Others felt a deep connection to their ancestral home and wanted to stay and rebuild, even if it meant facing similar risks in the future. "This is our land," insisted Roberto the blacksmith. "My grandfather built his first house right where mine stood before the flood. I'm not going to let a storm chase me away." But Isabella, still shaken by how close she had come to losing Pedro, felt differently. "I can't go through this again. I can't watch my child almost die while we wait for help that might never come." These conversations continued throughout the night as families grappled with decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. The immediate crisis was nearly over, but the long-term consequences were just beginning to become clear. Dr. Rodriguez spent the evening making detailed notes about each patient's condition and treatment needs. He wanted to provide the incoming medical team with as much information as possible so they could prioritize their care appropriately. Pedro would need follow-up treatment for his pneumonia. Sophia required monitoring to ensure she was recovering properly from childbirth. Several elderly villagers had chronic conditions that had been complicated by the stress and poor conditions of the past week. "You've done an amazing job," Maria told him as he worked by candlelight, carefully documenting everything he could remember about each patient's care. "Without you, we would have lost so many more people." The doctor shook his head humbly. "We saved each other. Everyone contributed something. That's how we survived." Baby Esperanza slept peacefully through the discussions and preparations, unaware that she would soon be taking her first airplane ride to a modern hospital where she could receive proper newborn care. Her parents had decided to accept evacuation to the regional capital, at least temporarily, where Sophia could recover fully and they could ensure their daughter got the best possible start in life. As the 9th day dawned clear and bright, the villagers could hear aircraft approaching long before they could see them. The sound grew steadily louder until 3 helicopters appeared over the mountains, flying in formation toward their small valley. "This is it," whispered Mayor Mendoza, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything we've been through, help is finally here." The lead helicopter circled the village once more, then began its careful descent toward the landing zone the villagers had prepared. Dust and debris swirled through the air as the powerful rotor wash stirred up everything loose on the ground. But none of the survivors cared about the dust or the noise. They stood together, holding hands and supporting each other, watching as their ordeal finally came to an end. The nightmare was over, the cavalry had arrived, and soon they would all be safe. The first helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and swirling debris, its rotors creating a thunderous noise that drowned out everything else. As soon as the aircraft settled on the ground, uniformed rescue personnel began pouring out, carrying medical equipment, supplies, and hope. Maria Santos watched in amazement as trained professionals took charge of the situation with calm efficiency. Paramedics immediately approached Dr. Rodriguez to get briefings on the medical priorities. Rescue coordinators began organizing the evacuation order. Supply specialists started distributing clean water, food, and basic necessities that the villagers hadn't seen in over a week. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Rodriguez with the National Emergency Response Team," said a woman in uniform, approaching Maria with a clipboard and a kind smile. "We're here to get everyone to safety. Can you help us understand who needs medical attention first?" It felt surreal to be talking to someone from outside their isolated bubble of survival. For 9 days, their world had consisted of just 42 people in a single building, and now suddenly there were strangers with clean uniforms and advanced equipment, treating their crisis as something manageable and routine. Dr. Rodriguez was already working with the medical team, explaining Pedro's condition and recovery, while they examined the boy with instruments and medications the village doctor could only dream of having. The paramedics nodded appreciatively as they reviewed his treatment notes, impressed by how much he had accomplished with so little. "You saved this child's life," one of the medics told him. "Without those antibiotics in your care, he wouldn't have made it." Sophia and baby Esperanza were loaded onto the first helicopter along with Pedro and 2 elderly villagers who needed immediate medical evaluation. Miguel climbed aboard with his wife and daughter, carrying a small bag containing their few remaining possessions. As the aircraft lifted off, Sophia pressed her face to the window and waved goodbye to the people who had become like family during their shared ordeal. "Take care of Esperanza," called out Isabella, shouting over the rotor noise. "Let her know she was born among people who loved her." The second helicopter brought more supplies and personnel, including engineers who immediately began assessing the damage to the village infrastructure. They took photographs and measurements documenting everything for insurance purposes and future rebuilding efforts. Mayor Mendoza worked closely with the emergency coordinators, providing them with lists of all the villagers and information about those who were still missing or unaccounted for. 3 families had been visiting relatives in other towns when the storm hit, and their empty houses had led to fears that they might be buried in the rubble. "We'll send teams to search every damaged building," promised Commander Santos, the operation leader. "We won't leave until we account for everyone." As the day progressed, helicopter after helicopter arrived and departed, ferrying villagers to safety in groups of 6 or 8. Each departure was emotional, with tearful goodbyes and promises to stay in touch. Families who had shared their last scraps of food and comforted each other through the darkest nights were now being separated, scattered to different evacuation centers and temporary housing facilities. Isabella and Pedro were among the second group to be evacuated. As they climbed into the helicopter, Pedro turned back to wave at the people who had helped save his life. His recovery had become a symbol of hope for everyone, proof that they could survive even the worst circumstances. "Will we see each other again?" asked little Anna, tears streaming down her face as she watched her friends leave. "Of course we will," her mother assured her, though privately she wondered if that was true. The rescue operation was breaking up their community and sending people in different directions. Some would rebuild in San Rafael, others would relocate permanently, and a few might never return to the mountains at all. Maria chose to stay until the very end, helping coordinate the evacuation and ensuring that no one was left behind. She watched as the shelter that had been their home for 9 days was systematically emptied of people and supplies. Soon it would be just an empty building again, but it would always be the place where 42 people had proven that human beings could endure anything when they supported each other. Juan the mechanic carefully packed up the radio that had been their connection to the outside world. "This old thing saved our lives," he told one of the rescue technicians. "Without it, we never would have known that people were looking for us." Father Antonio was among the last to leave, conducting a brief memorial service for Carmen Flores, whose body had been respectfully prepared for transport back to her family's burial plot. Even in death, she would be returning home to the village cemetery where her husband and parents were buried. She held on long enough to see Pedro recover. The priest said softly, "I think she knew that new life was coming into the world, and she didn't want to leave us until she was sure we would be okay." As the final helicopter prepared for departure, Maria took one last look around the devastated village. The houses where she had taught children, the church where she had been married, the school where she had worked for 15 years, all of it was gone or badly damaged. But the people had survived. The community had endured. "Are you ready, ma'am?" asked the pilot, extending his hand to help her into the aircraft. Maria nodded and climbed aboard, sitting next to Mayor Mendoza and the handful of other villagers who had waited until the end. As the helicopter lifted off and began climbing toward the mountain pass, she looked down at San Rafael one more time. From the air, she could see the full extent of the destruction, the new path carved by the river, the debris fields where houses used to stand, the landslide scars on the mountainsides. But she could also see the hopeful signs, the large help signal they had built, the cleared landing area, the evidence of human determination and resourcefulness. "Will you rebuild?" asked Commander Santos, following her gaze out the window. "Some of us will," Maria replied, "and some of us will start over somewhere else. But either way, we'll remember what we learned here. We'll remember that no storm is stronger than people who refuse to give up on each other." 6 months later, Maria returned to San Rafael for the dedication of the new community center. About half of the original villagers had chosen to come back and rebuild, while others had settled permanently in towns with better access to medical care and emergency services. The new buildings were constructed to higher standards, designed to withstand future floods and storms. A plaque near the entrance honored Carmen Flores and celebrated the birth of Esperanza Herrera, recognizing both the loss and the hope that had defined their survival story. Pedro, now completely recovered and grown taller, helped unveil the memorial, while his mother Isabella wiped away tears of remembrance and gratitude. Baby Esperanza, now crawling and babbling happily, had no memory of the dramatic circumstances of her birth, but she would grow up hearing the story of how she came into the world during her community's darkest hour, when hope had nearly vanished until the sound of a C-130 transport plane cut through the clouds like thunder, bringing with it the promise that no one would be forgotten or left behind. The new San Rafael was smaller but stronger, a community bonded by shared survival and mutual dependence. And on clear days when aircraft flew overhead, the villagers would pause in their work and wave, remembering the morning when the sky brought salvation and the world remembered they existed. The first helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and swirling debris. its rotors creating a thunderous noise that drowned out everything else. As soon as the aircraft settled on the ground, uniformed rescue personnel began pouring out, carrying medical equipment, supplies, and hope. Maria Santos watched in amazement as trained professionals took charge of the situation with calm efficiency. Paramedics immediately approached Dr. Rodriguez to get briefings on the medical priorities. Rescue coordinators began organizing the evacuation order. Supply specialists started distributing clean water, food, and basic necessities that the villagers hadn't seen in over a week. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Rodriguez with the National Emergency Response Team," said a woman in uniform, approaching Maria with a clipboard and a kind smile. "We're here to get everyone to safety. Can you help us understand who needs medical attention first?" It felt surreal to be talking to someone from outside their isolated bubble of survival. For 9 days, their world had consisted of just 42 people in a single building, and now suddenly there were strangers with clean uniforms and advanced equipment, treating their crisis as something manageable and routine. Dr. Rodriguez was already working with the medical team, explaining Pedro's condition and recovery, while they examined the boy with instruments and medications the village doctor could only dream of having. The paramedics nodded appreciatively as they reviewed his treatment notes, impressed by how much he had accomplished with so little. "You saved this child's life," one of the medics told him. "Without those antibiotics in your care, he wouldn't have made it." Sofia and baby Esperanza were loaded onto the first helicopter along with Pedro and 2 elderly villagers who needed immediate medical evaluation. Miguel climbed aboard with his wife and daughter, carrying a small bag containing their few remaining possessions. As the aircraft lifted off, Sofia pressed her face to the window and waved goodbye to the people who had become like family during their shared ordeal. "Take care of Esperanza," called out Isabella, shouting over the rotor noise. "Let her know she was born among people who loved her." The second helicopter brought more supplies and personnel, including engineers who immediately began assessing the damage to the village infrastructure. They took photographs and measurements documenting everything for insurance purposes and future rebuilding efforts. Mayor Mendoza worked closely with the emergency coordinators, providing them with lists of all the villagers and information about those who were still missing or unaccounted for. 3 families had been visiting relatives in other towns when the storm hit, and their empty houses had led to fears that they might be buried in the rubble. "We'll send teams to search every damaged building," promised Commander Santos, the operation leader. "We won't leave until we account for everyone." As the day progressed, helicopter after helicopter arrived and departed, ferrying villagers to safety in groups of 6 or 8. Each departure was emotional, with tearful goodbyes and promises to stay in touch. Families who had shared their last scraps of food and comforted each other through the darkest nights were now being separated, scattered to different evacuation centers and temporary housing facilities. Isabella and Pedro were among the second group to be evacuated. As they climbed into the helicopter, Pedro turned back to wave at the people who had helped save his life. His recovery had become a symbol of hope for everyone, proof that they could survive even the worst circumstances. "Will we see each other again?" asked little Anna, tears streaming down her face as she watched her friends leave. "Of course we will," her mother assured her, though privately she wondered if that was true. The rescue operation was breaking up their community and sending people in different directions. Some would rebuild in San Rafael, others would relocate permanently, and a few might never return to the mountains at all. Maria chose to stay until the very end, helping coordinate the evacuation and ensuring that no one was left behind. She watched as the shelter that had been their home for 9 days was systematically emptied of people and supplies. Soon it would be just an empty building again, but it would always be the place where 42 people had proven that human beings could endure anything when they supported each other. Juan the mechanic carefully packed up the radio that had been their connection to the outside world. "This old thing saved our lives," he told one of the rescue technicians. "Without it, we never would have known that people were looking for us." Father Antonio was among the last to leave, conducting a brief memorial service for Carmen Flores, whose body had been respectfully prepared for transport back to her family's burial plot. Even in death, she would be returning home to the village cemetery where her husband and parents were buried. She held on long enough to see Pedro recover. The priest said softly, "I think she knew that new life was coming into the world." and she didn't want to leave us until she was sure we would be okay. As the final helicopter prepared for departure, Maria took one last look around the devastated village. The houses where she had taught children, the church where she had been married, the school where she had worked for 15 years, all of it was gone or badly damaged. But the people had survived. The community had endured. "Are you ready, ma'am?" asked the pilot, extending his hand to help her into the aircraft. Maria nodded and climbed aboard, sitting next to Mayor Mendoza and the handful of other villagers who had waited until the end. As the helicopter lifted off and began climbing toward the mountain pass, she looked down at San Rafael one more time. From the air, she could see the full extent of the destruction, the new path carved by the river, the debris fields where houses used to stand, the landslide scars on the mountainsides. But she could also see the hopeful signs, the large help signal they had built, the cleared landing area, the evidence of human determination and resourcefulness. "Will you rebuild?" asked Commander Santos, following her gaze out the window. "Some of us will," Maria replied, "and some of us will start over somewhere else. But either way, we'll remember what we learned here. We'll remember that no storm is stronger than people who refuse to give up on each other." 6 months later, Maria returned to San Rafael for the dedication of the new community center. About half of the original villagers had chosen to come back and rebuild, while others had settled permanently in towns with better access to medical care and emergency services. The new buildings were constructed to higher standards, designed to withstand future floods and storms. A plaque near the entrance honored Carmen Flores and celebrated the birth of Esperanza Herrera, recognizing both the loss and the hope that had defined their survival story. Pedro, now completely recovered and grown taller, helped unveil the memorial, while his mother Isabella wiped away tears of remembrance and gratitude. Baby Esperanza, now crawling and babbling happily, had no memory of the dramatic circumstances of her birth, but she would grow up hearing the story of how she came into the world during her community's darkest hour, when hope had nearly vanished until the sound of a C-130 transport plane cut through the clouds like thunder, bringing with it the promise that no one would be forgotten or left behind. The new San Rafael was smaller but stronger, a community bonded by shared survival and mutual dependence. And on clear days when aircraft flew overhead, the villagers would pause in their work and wave, remembering the morning when the sky brought salvation and the world remembered they existed.